Hello and welcome to our final session of the conference. The session is called The Global Tax Justice Policy Horizon, FACTI, the United Nations and the OECD, Where Next for Global Taxing Rights. We have three contributions today from Logan Wart, who is the Executive Secretary of African Tax Administration Forum, otherwise known as ATAF. Logan's been the group executive at the South African Revenue Service and was a Deputy Director General at the National Treasury of South Africa. So he knows a thing or two about tax. Our second contributor is Manuel Butch Montes, who's an economist and senior advisor for the Society for International Development, previously as senior advisor on finance and development at the South Centre, and also been a chief of development and policy analysis at the United Nations. Our third and final contribution is from Irene Avonji Adida, who is a lawyer, a women's rights activist, a FACTI panelist, which is the Financial Accountability and Transparency and Integrity high-level panel, formerly a panelist on the Mbeki panel, which produced a seminal report in 2015 on the impact of illicit financial flows on African countries. And Irene is also a commissioner for ICRIT, another acronym there for you, the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation. Just before we get started, I just wanted to remind you, and for those of you who've not joined a previous session, on the right side of your screen, you should be able to see the live discussion tab where you can post your comments and hopefully you have some questions to ask. On the left of your screen, if you scroll down, you will find a button for interpretation. So scroll down and that if you need interpretation in Spanish. So first of all, I'm going to give a brief introduction, then I'm going to hand over to Logan, Butch and Irene to give some comments, and then we'll, in the traditional format, have time for questions, and I've got some questions as well if you're feeling shy, but I guess you won't be. So just some reflections really on the week and how we started the week, in fact, which we began with the launch of a report that we've produced in Tax Justice Network called the 4 R's and the Realizations of Rights. And it set out the pivotal role of progressive taxation systems, of its ability to support the realization of rights through the means of raising sustainable revenue, redistributing income and wealth, repricing public bads, and strengthening representative democratic governance through greater transparency and accountability, and thereby over time strengthening tax morale. And I think you've through the week heard lots of examples, including of today, of how we are aspiring and envisaging that can happen, and particularly by the closer and less siloed work of tax justice and human rights. And the report used as its illustration of the damaging relationship between tax and human rights, the impact of tax abuse on determinants of health. and it noted that every year 17 million more people could benefit from clean water and 34 million people from basic sanitation if revenue losses due to global tax abuse were reversed. These are fundamental human rights and are essential for survival. And over a 10-year period projected, these gains would be associated with the reversal of 600,000 child deaths or 73,000 maternal deaths. Now that evidence, I think, is shocking, and it is shameful that our governments, especially rich country governments, prevaricate and obfuscate and thereby fail in their duty to curtail inequalities and reform discriminatory policies and advance human rights. The report went on, which is where we get to this session, to policy responses. It talked about the ABC of the policy transparency platform. but it also turned to the issue of who makes the rules around tax, what are the institutions, and what's the power behind them. So, this is, I think, worth saying, if it's not incredibly obvious, this is a highly political set of issues and a political set of interests from all sides of the camp. So I'm going to hand over to our panelists, who can perhaps help us sort of situate those interests in the political context and help us better understand the opportunities and the challenges of the current tax policy reform that's happening now. And Logan, I wanted to turn to you first and ask for your reflections on the OECD reform proposals as you see it on the behalf of African nations and African countries, and how this deal was struck, and perhaps summarize what the deal is, which might be helpful for some people, how it might be implemented, and who decides. I mean, I was interested and wondered how far does the OECD's, for instance, 131 countries sign up, as it describes them, reflect the reality of African support for the proposals. And I also noticed that in the ATAF press release on the inclusive framework statement, warned that the OECD against coercion of states to sign up. And I wondered what that was referring to, whether you felt able to talk to that. So over to you, Logan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Les, and thank you for the invitation, and also to the rest of the panelists and everybody. It's been a very hard and interesting 2.5, 3 years in this whole discussion about the taxation of the digital economy. And so since the publishing of the inclusive framework agreement that will go to the G20, there has been, and rightly so, a lot of discussion. And so essentially for ATAF and Africa, we've been involved in this long-running discussion over the past while, mainly to address the tax challenges of the tax implications of the digital economy. But what it really was, as everybody knows, it was fundamentally a making of new rules for global taxing rights. And a lot of issues goes with that. But essentially, ATAF and the AU presented a set of proposals that we believe are the minimum to be impactful for developing countries in general, and for African countries in particular, for a new deal to work. And so over the process of the 3 years, in October last year, the inclusive framework finally published a blueprint of what this deal will be. By March of this year, I contacted the OECD for ATAF and had contacted them and said, look, we've looked at this draft deal and there's nothing in here for developing countries. There's nothing in here for African countries. In fact, it's not worth continuing this conversation, because this clearly seems to be a conversation about what is convenient for developed countries, and the rest of us seem to be collateral damage. That was the conversation that was had in March. And we then indicated that we have drafted our own set of proposals, which we would want tabled. And so this we duly did at the end of March. And the key elements of the African proposals, and these were proposals supported that went through the structures of the Ministers of Finance and the Commission of the African Union, was essentially details around the greater allocation of profits of multinational enterprises to source countries. In the bigger scheme of the deal, one of the key deal breakers in what is called Pillar 1 of this deal was that they wanted mandatory binding arbitration on all tax treaty disputes, not on specific disputes related to the digital economy, but all disputes on all treaties. And no African country was prepared to accept this. And that was one of the elements of our proposal, that there should not be mandatory binding arbitration of treaty disputes. Also, we requested a minimum effective tax rate on all multinational enterprises of more than 20%, given the fact that the average of multinational or corporate tax in Africa is more than 30%. We wanted to make sure that profit shifting is significantly reduced. And we also required what we call a tax-based, a source-based tax rule, a subject to tax rule to redress the current imbalance, because in the current OECD treaty, it gives taxing rights to residence countries, whereas the UN and the ATAB model treaties gives more taxing rights to source countries. So those were the essence of the proposals that we presented. So that, together with everybody else's proposals, of course, is discussed in the steering group. Now, these structures are all formed around the sort of structures of the OECD, and we can talk about, you know, the platform and all of that a little bit later. You did ask me about that. And so now we have the outcome. The outcome is 131 countries signed up, and therefore to what is called this high-level political agreement. What is significant is that there are countries who did not yet sign up. In Africa, that is Kenya and Nigeria. And yet, and so you cannot say there is full consensus. Importantly, from within that 130 countries that have signed up, a lot of them have signed up with reservations and with areas that they feel is unresolved. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done, despite the fact that there's high-level political agreement on the structure of this. So what did we then therefore get out of this deal? For developing countries in general and for African countries, not what we wanted. But let's talk about what did we get. We got a greater simplification in the tax rules. We managed to get a reduction in the nexus threshold from 5 million to 1 million euros and 250,000 euros for smaller economies. So your ability to collect tax based on turnover then becomes, the threshold is lower, so your opportunity to collect is a lot better in general. But importantly, Liz and colleagues, there were significant things we did not get. Our major concern regarding the original blueprint was, of course, the imposition of mandatory binding dispute resolution mechanism. We did not succeed. What was eventually decided was, what we did succeed in is that the mandatory binding mechanism will now not apply to all treaty mechanisms, but countries will be bound to some form of mandatory binding arbitration, except if you are from a sort of smaller market jurisdiction who do not have the ability or the skills, you may be exempt from this. Also, we managed to get the removal of some other technical amounts within there, which is a bit too long to explain. Importantly, also, what we did not get, and these are significant things we did not get. We did not get the reallocation of profits of multinationals, what we call the routine profit, the normal profit they make, to recipient countries, to market jurisdictions. Instead, what is being discussed is the reallocation of what they call residual profit, profit beyond the normal profit, to market jurisdictions, so developing countries, African countries in general. We then said, if that's the case, we want a minimum of 35%, and we did not get that. The amount being discussed is between 20 and 30%. So just technically, I'm spending a small moment just to go through that. And the last part on the technical side is to say that on pillar 2, which aims to ensure that all global profits of multinationals are taxed at least at the minimum effective tax rate. In our proposal, we requested a minimum tax rate for all multinationals of beyond 20%. Bearing in mind that most African countries' corporate tax rates are between 25 and 30%. The agreement has a 15% minimum tax rate. It is not ideal, but that is what we got out of our request for more than 20%. And so when one considers the outcome in terms of this high-level outcome, the objectives of African countries, there were some positive outcomes and some negative outcomes. Our primary concern has been that the current international tax rules don't permit us to tax profits earned by many highly digitalized businesses. So it's clear in that the new rules, whilst we did not get everything, and there's a lot we didn't get, they will, for now, result in an improved allocation of some profits to those jurisdictions that would not have received them before. And so pillar 1 will result in some greater allocation of multinational profits to market jurisdictions. We should have gotten a lot more. But the effect of the current agreement, though not ideal, would significantly improve the revenue of developing country income, although this is not what we have totally asked for. And so in the bigger scheme of things, that is where the deal stands. And the calls, and so that is where the deal stands, and that is how it will go to the G20. And so it does call on a lot of things. It calls on, yes, one can examine the deal in itself, but there are other things that I guess the world is examining, and rightly so. And that is the platform, the legitimacy of the platform, who participated, and all of that. What I can tell you is that in the inclusive framework and in that platform, African countries were represented by tax administrations. A lot of other countries were represented by the policymakers and people with political mandate. Most African countries did not have their political mandate or principles there. And the gap between administration and policy in most countries around the world when it comes to tax is very wide. So maybe just to say what has been our experience. Our experience as ATAF in this process has been that the value of the technical African-based support to African countries over the past 3 years on this matter has been pivotal in our ability to respond. Convening the many consultations with the 38 member countries, 28 who have been consistent, have been pivotal. The technical notes, and we were the only one, other than the OECD itself, that published technical notes on these proposals, were really important in the final proposal, and eventually the buy-in by the African Union Commission and its ministers of finance. However, the absence of awareness, understanding, and involvement of African political leaders was a problem, because in the developed world, in their parliaments, in their cabinets, everybody was aware. There was directives, there was discussion, there was interest. We did not feel that on the continent. We felt very much isolated and alone for most part of the 3 years of this work. The policy and administration gap left a lot to be desired for us, and importantly, our work with others in the world of tax. Whilst we had solidarity with civil society structures like TJN Africa and others, we have great relationship with on the continent. We did not amalgamate our technical expertise and our lobby potential to work on what the final outcome is. And so finally, there are two things that's important for me. It appears, and this comes to your question about pressure, it appears to me that there was massive diplomatic initiatives in the days running up to the final agreement, maybe even political pressure, and this is a concern. Secondly, if the inclusive framework and the OECD, sorry, let me say that that's the one part of the final two things. The second part is something that is important for me to express, and this is that the inclusive framework and the OECD created this platform and invited the world to join. Yes, it is not ideal. It is not. But in the absence of anything else, and in a world where the G20 was going to make decisions on a new global tax rules, we had to be there to ensure that we fight for our taxing rights. There is no moment where somebody is going to declare equal taxing rights for the world. And in the absence of anything else, that is where things are happening. But we need an independent global tax body. I don't know if the UN is the platform. In the current investment it's making in its tax committee, that is not sufficient. Meanwhile, tax standards are being set in Paris. And whether we like it or not, whether it's legitimate or not, that's where it's happening, and it results, find itself in the form of treaties, in the form of financial outflows, in the form of sanctions. And if you're not there to fight for those, to fight against those things, you lose. Standing outside and objecting to it is not enough. You've got to be there to fight, and that is what we believe countries from Africa certainly did when we were there. So while we rally a call for better governance, a better governance platform, there has to be a better governance platform. Yes, we did not get the deal we wanted, but we are getting more taxes from multinational enterprise profit. And that is something we did not have before. A lot needs to be done. This is not ideal, but we got what we could, certainly for Africa. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Logan. That's it. And you kind of nicely bring us to sort of direct some time and some questions towards Butch, and kind of a combination of your experience of the UN and your work with the G77, and you know, just kind of sort of your reflections and comments about, you know, that kind of that movement in is the UN fit for purpose if, you know, we were able to move that way.
Thanks, Liz. It's a very big privilege for me to be addressing the Tax Justice Network community, which is a very important community as far as, from my point of view, financing for development is concerned. And what I take immediately from Logan's intervention is that the dire outcome that comes out of the G7 decision is really coming from the fact that we developing countries did not face this issue as a political matter, even though from the very beginning, as you yourself said, it was a political matter. And for us, the question is, to what extent can we developing countries begin to mobilize our own selves, right? With respect to matters that actually affect our right to development at the very end of the day. So Logan's view is that we need, in order to make these the allocation of taxing rights more just, right, and more equitable. We need to mobilize our own political capabilities to do so. Let me now talk quickly about what you asked about. And my experience is from the fact that I was for a while, I was secretary of the UN Tax Committee and met some of the characters that are now very active in this OECD work, right? When a platform is being hosted by the OECD, right, what you have is a secretariat, and I was a secretariat in the UN too, right? And I was the secretary of the UN Tax Committee. That secretariat actually reports to the people who are its employers, right? And the Secretariat in this particular case, at this time, there are 38 member states of the OECD, and some of them are more dominant than others. When they write up text, when they consider proposals, when they finalize the text, actually, that Secretariat is only accountable to the 38 and probably the most dominant member states of that body. And this is why relying on the hosting by the OECD Secretariat for setting these kinds of standards is going to always put we developing countries in the position of supplicants, right? And then you have to, and this is why we always interpret the outcomes of the inclusive framework as if we were supplicants, right? Even though, and actually, Logan actually characterized it very well, we are actually able to match in terms of technical capability the stuff that is coming out of the OECD. And this is my experience actually when I was at the South Center. We were organizing tax administrators, a network of tax administrators, and they have actually identified a lot of alternative ways to do the same kinds of convoluted, complex practices, which the OECD prefers, because those convoluted practices facilitate the transfer of profits out of the developing countries where the economic activities take place and into the resident countries. For example, we published a whole book, right, with these kinds of other alternative practices of how, for example, to run a patent box, which for example, Brazil has a long-term experience on how to reduce the kinds of outflows on patent boxes with its own laws, right? And what we were trying to do was actually to form a network in which tax administrators would share with each other, right? All of these technical views. So let me then come to the in the open forum we can talk about how a UN body would work, right? And there are normal questions about where does the UN have the capability? Does the UN have the expertise? Will it take too long to do things in the United Nations? Logan says it doesn't have to be in the United Nations. Well, yes, it doesn't have to be in the United Nations, but our experience, the most recent experience of this is the WTO. The developed countries insisted that the WTO would not be a UN body. In the end, right, a lot of the work of the WTO comes crawling back to the UN because of a lot of the countries require some of the principles coming out of the WTO. And secondly, the kinds of secretariat support that the UN has a lot of experience on has to be reinvented, had to be reinvented in the WTO because the developed countries insisted that the WTO is not a UN body. So it's almost a question of it doesn't matter, right? The UN has a lot of experience running these things, and the example I would like to give is the Commission on Statistics of the United Nations, which sets up standards for calculating gross national product or gross domestic product. And this is quite a complicated issue. And the way the UN has this is that there are 24 member state nominated experts that are part of this committee that sets those standards, right? They have 4-year terms, and they set those standards because they represent the country which had nominated them. The countries are elected in the same way that countries in the Human Rights Council are elected by all of the member states in the United Nations, right? So they are elected, so they don't represent only even though they're experts, they don't represent only their technical expertise. They represent the region. There is a equitable distribution of the region. the region and the kind of country they come from, right? So this is, and with this kind of a formation, you actually have a view. You have actually a situation where we, citizens of developing countries, can require those representatives of ours, even though they are experts. I mean, they're chosen as experts to propose and to fight for standards that are in our interest, right? And this is not the case with respect to the inclusive framework, because in the end, there's a secretariat there that reports to a higher god, right? And the higher god are their employers, right? These are the 38 members of the OECD. Whereas in the United States, in the United Nations, the higher god, first of all, is the Bureau of the Statistical Commission, or maybe the Bureau of if a tax body in the UN would organize itself, there would be a chair, there would be a rapporteur, there would be vice chairs, and all that stuff. The Secretariat reports to that. And secondly, any agreements that come out of a UN tax body would be sent to the ECOSOC, to the Economic and Social Council, and agreed to by all of the other countries that are part of the UN. And therefore, it does make a big difference, because our political leaders would be forced by the nature of the structure to pay attention to these kinds of decisions, right? So let me just end very quickly. I didn't want to talk too long. Let me talk very quickly about because the third question that I was asked is, what can civil society do, right? Well, the first thing that civil society do is to respond to what Logan actually said, right? We have to make sure our leaders understand what is at stake in these kinds of decisions, such as the G7 decision that just came out at the beginning of July, right? We must force all our representatives who participate in these negotiations to read the material that is circulated and to require our governments to take their own positions, right? So this is what civil society, I mean, I'm conscious I'm talking to an international network of civil society groups. I actually have it from some kind of source, which I cannot divulge, that there are 14 states that signed on to the 131 that, the OECD likes to say, 131 states. The journalists don't understand this, right? There are 14 states that never attended even a single meeting of the inclusive framework, but they are now counted as part of the 131. We don't know whether they actually read a lot of the material that came out of the, and this kind of structure would not be the case if it were a political body. And you said we started off with that idea. So that's the first thing, right? And secondly, we must break the accountability problem of a OECD-based negotiations, which often require our invited representatives to keep the negotiating text secret, right? And require that our negotiators, our representatives there, at least share privately or whatever, based on with our legislators and with our executive branches, what is at stake in these kinds of negotiations. We must share with our negotiators the fact that there exist negotiators, civil society, like TJN, for example. TJN should quadruple its efforts to share with the negotiators of developing countries that there exists superior technical proposals, right, that are superior to the OECD. And this is the kind of thing that we keep on hearing now, right? And finally, as we face September, we must, I would say that civil society globally must actually work very hard to begin the process of implementing 14B. 14B is the recommendation from FACTI, which Irene will probably mention a little bit. Is that of an intergovernmental body in the UN, right? In the coming General Assembly negotiations. So let me stop there. We can talk a lot about details, and sure, I'm just trying to keep it very short, right? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Butch. Irene, I think both Logan and Butch have sort of really set a picture where power is not shared, where results and success is partial. My understanding of the FACTI panel report was that it was not for some of the people of the world, but all for the people of the world, and its recommendations. So tell us a little bit about the FACTI panel itself and your hopes and opportunities. What do you see as the challenges, the barriers?
Thank you very much, and thanks Logan and Manuel. That was really excellent. Setting the stage for what I'll be doing. Quick joke. I was watching the previous sessions of this conference for the past few days, including today, and just a second or two to the start of this panel, realized that I was watching and I wasn't actually on a Zoom where I could speak. I started looking for the Zoom link that Liz had thoughtfully shared this morning, and I was just thinking of the limitations of technology. And if it works that way for me, who's been in so many of these kind of sessions, what about for the rest of the citizens of the world? And those are some of the things we need to think about. How do we link these issues to the real lives of people who they impact on? I'll start very quickly with the FACTI one, and then connect it to some of my other thoughts and reflections. I want to start with the FACTI because I do talk a lot. I just want to make sure I get that in, before I run out of time. It really effectively from what Logan has said, it is clear that the recommendations that we made at the FACTI panel and which really reflect long-standing positions and demands of developing countries through G77 and through specific groups like Africa Group and others, but also of the tax justice community globally, is that there has to be reform. The FACTI report, which came out in February, really affirmed those positions. And this was based on the extensive consultation that we did the whole of last year with the UN members, with regional groupings, with specific institutions, including OECD, IMF, the US Treasury, and so on, the African Union, and others, Asia and Latin America. So, and of course, expertise, that the input that was made by many of you who are on this session. So there was extensive consultation, and it's very much evidence-based. I still recall on the issue of mandatory and arbitrary resolution of disputes that Logan talked about. The input by UN members. Pakistan always resonated with me on this. How they talked about the direct cost to their economies, to their treasuries, of some of those mechanisms which are quite opaque, and quite skewed, asymmetrical, and really biased towards the interests of the corporations as opposed to interests of states, including increasingly states in the global north, or in Europe, I would say, that have lost out to some of these decisions. So what the FACTI came out with is really very much evidence-based, and we're also building on the work of previous reports, whether it's UNCTAD or the Mbeki panel that I was a part of, and also a lot of research that's been done by the tax justice community. And I would say three broad things that we came out with, and there are 14 recommendations. The report is available online. It's very easily accessible, very easy to read, but three broad areas I would say in relation to tax that we had. One of them was around the whole question of governance, and Manuel has talked to that very much so, that there needs to be new international architecture reforms in taxation. And that should include, one, a UN tax convention, especially to ensure that there are tax transparency standards established through an open and inclusive legal instrument that should be negotiated at the UN with a far impartial international tax dispute mechanism. So that we were very clear about that. The body that should be the instrument that holds the rules and the norms around international taxation should be international, not the current system that we have under the OECD, backed up by the EU and others. Secondly, that there should be a UN intergovernmental body. We currently do have the UN Tax Experts Committee, but we need to have this built up into an intergovernmental body which can coordinate tax and financial integrity systems, because overall, the thrust of the report was looking at the state of the global financial system and the lack of financial integrity within it. And so there's a need to have this sort of body that will have that broad mandate for taxation in the manner in which Manuel has talked about, a process that would enable participation by all 192 members of the UN, and it will look broadly at financial integrity and the lack of it currently, the lack of transparency, the lack of accountability, and both Manuel and Logan have spoken to that. And that there should also be a center for monitoring tax rights to collect and disseminate national, aggregate, and detailed data about taxation and a tax cooperation on a global basis. We know that currently there are a lot of asymmetries that even where there has been progress, for example, say UN has come up, the OECD has come up with things like the common reporting standards and so on, or progress around automatic exchange of information, we know that there are asymmetries in access to information under those systems set up by the OECD. So this would be to ensure that all countries can access that information equally. So that was the broad thrust of what we had around governance to really change the current power imbalance in the defining of rules around taxation and in allocation of taxing rights, which has been the issue for the past few decades, which have been set by a few countries to their benefit. And this latest deal by the G7 just kind of illustrates that, what has happened for the past maybe 70 years or so. On relation to the other two broad areas, we also talked about corporate taxation reform based on unitary taxation of multinational corporations, based on global group profit. Effective capital gains taxation was in part of that recommendation, tax on digital services, and a global minimum corporate tax at a rate of 20 to 30%, taking into account that developing countries depend much more on corporate tax. They have higher average tax rates, as Logan has said, and this is across the board, not just in Africa, but even in other regions of the global south. We have much higher rates. So very low minimum rates effectively would create a race to that minimum would likely become the new maximum. And pressure would be exerted, as always happens, by corporations and by the countries that they come from on countries in the developing world to reduce their taxes. So it would increase leverage for those with more power currently in the system. So this was very clear and was also building on some of the recommendations of groups like ICRIT that TGAN and others are part of. And lastly, there was a policy platform that we recommended based on the ABC of tax transparency, with automatic exchange of information to end tax information sharing asymmetries between countries, beneficial ownership in order to boost the fight against anti-money laundering, and just generally to have more information about who actually owns these corporations that are doing so much, causing so much harm, I would say, and extracted so much in many countries, and also country-by-country reporting of multinational corporation accounting and financial information, all to improve tax transparency. So these were the broad recommendations that we had relating to tax. There were others relating to corruption, to anti-corruption, to money laundering, and so on. But why is this really important for us? If you look at the report, we also talk about the scale of resources we stand to gain. And I think TJN has also put out a lot of data around that. I reflect on how the Becky panel report in 2015, we found 50 to 60 billion lost in illicit financial flows just from Africa per annum. A few years later, just last year, a report by UNCTAD finds that this has grown now to almost 89 billion lost from Africa. And similar figures lost from Latin America and the Caribbean, lost from Asia. And increasingly, one would see lost from countries within Europe. So the losses beginning to have impact on all countries, much as developing countries lose much more in terms of the size of their economies and are hurt much more. Everybody is affected apart from a minority, an elite, a global elite who happen to be located in primarily the G7 countries and such countries, and game the system against everybody else, including their own citizens, including increasingly members of their own countries. So yesterday there was a comment made by Nicholas Shackton I think was really important because there's we talk about secrecy jurisdictions, tax havens, and so on, And for the most part, you find that in many people's minds, the first thing they will think about, oh, these Caribbean countries and so on. But a couple of things that he said that I think for me were really important. One of them connected to this is that they find that increasingly oversized financial sectors harm not only other countries, not only the global system and the global economy, but increasingly the jurisdictions that host them. So other sectors within those countries, whether you're talking about Jersey Islands, the British dependencies, or whichever other ones, they increasingly harm those locations which host them. The other sectors, the real economy in those countries also lose. And you have growing inequality in those countries as well as growing inequality between countries. So this is a fight for the 99%, really, against the 1%. And we need to understand that more and more and start building the global coalitions. And I know that a lot of the work many of you are doing is towards that, but we need to do that much smarter and much more deliberately. And I think in the previous session I was listening to, Ashra talked about this as well, and a couple of other people talked about that as well, how to build that much more deliberately, how to break the silos. I think there was the document that was prepared by Latin American civil society recently, and there was a previous panel on that, which is looking at human rights and tax and bringing that together, that rights-based approach, and using the principles of human rights to interrogate these issues. More and more, we need to have more of that kind of collaboration. Coming back to the specifics around tax and justice. So some of the issues, obviously many people here are experts, or many may not be. Issues around tax regimes, around regressive taxation, around double taxation agreements, tax incentives, tax minimization by multinational corporations, BEPS practices, base erosion and profit shifting practices. All of these are the kind of things we're looking at. But the connection, and my colleagues have talked about the connection of tax to the other sectors, is something that really means that for civil society, there must be a more collective and holistic coming together of progressive coalitions, but for governments, also the need to have a much more whole of government approach. So we see, for example, with the G7 deal, that many other countries have been pushed into signing because of pressure. And I saw from my experience as a legislator engaging and supporting my governments in the East African region on WTO about 20 years ago, the kind of pressure that would come through the trade arena. So we see trade being used, we see aid being used, so you have things like the EU blacklist. You want aid from us, sign on to this or join the OECD quote unquote inclusive framework. I just can't bring myself to call it an inclusive framework. I have to really call it a quote unquote, right? So we use trade, they'll use investments. So you have the bilateral investment treaties also playing a role in this. All of these to tie up countries in the global south and to fragment ability to have a collective response. So in the action looking forward, we must look at this across the board. Let's look at aid. Let's look at debt and what's happening now with COVID and even pre-COVID around predatory private financing and debt, to countries and how that's tying up countries. We've heard of a number of countries in Africa and Asia losing out on assets, on national assets because of debt. So you can't pay, and so you hand over a port, you hand over. So it's a real threat. And in this agreement specifically, one of the big risks for me related to the mandatory arbitration that Logan talked about is for countries to close off their future policy space. And this is the kind of thing that we see as well within the WTO system, the closing off of your ability to make decisions in the future and to tie yourself in because of the few benefits that may come your way in accepting a deal with, of course, the pressure not against not signing. Last thing I'll talk about, and really this is two. One of them is that we have to look at these things also in terms of the broader issue really is about the right to development and recognition that the right to development is not just for the 1%. It's not just for the G7 countries. It's a right for all. So how do we, the 99%, who are seen as unpeople, there's a British journalist who wrote a book about that some years ago, 2005, who are seen as unpeople, who really have no rights and don't really matter. How do we work together and build the collective power to fight against this, because the multinational, the resistance, the coalition between them and governments is very real and is very dirty. We went through a lot of pressure. I saw it during the FACTI process, both on ourselves, on the secretariat, and on governments that were speaking up within the UN process around the need for FACTI and the need for these kind of reforms. And as we move towards the General Assembly, and I'm glad that Manuel has flagged that, there will be continue to be pressure on governments to make sure that these issues don't make their way into UN resolutions or into UN processes, to actually actualize the recommendations of the report, which would then be of no use if they do not become part of systems or initiate negotiations on the tax treaty and the tax body. And the last thing I'll just say is that it's a political issue. It's ideological, and that's very political, as we know in the feminist movements. And in terms of ideology, it also shapes narratives. So we need to interrogate some of the narratives that come out to support this hegemonic and monopolistic and predatory system that we are looking at in the global financial and economic system. Think about things like 5 to 6 companies controlling primary commodity market. That is crazy. So you think about things like that, who controls all of these? So these rules are not just happening around tax, they're happening around maritime shipping, they're happening around law and what lawyers can do and confidentiality, and therefore they can support corporations and the wealthy to continue with IFFs. They happen around auditing and accounting, and therefore support transfer pricing and BEPS. So who sets all of these rules? Banking, who sets those rules? And how open are those processes? And then we've talked about dispute resolution. So it's very broad, and we must come together and bring together the political and the technical and challenge the narratives that are put out there. That this happens because developing countries had no proposals, they had. This happens because they have no technical expertise, they have. This happens because they don't really have any skin in the game, they have. So we must challenge those narratives, the role of academia and the role of civil society to challenge the false narratives that don't see the real capacities and the real inequalities created by this system must be put out by us in a way that's accessible to ordinary people, so they can bring in their power and help us to build the power against it. I'll stop here. I did say I talk a lot.
You did, and it was all good. Thank you, Irene. I mean, actually, all of you have really, in different ways, brought out how actually the challenge feels very much about it is a political issue, how we wrestle power away from an established nexus of elite rich countries, and how we go about doing that. I'm conscious I've got about 6 minutes left, and there's a couple of questions in which I might ask you to answer quite briefly, and then I'll try and come back to you all with some sort of reflections before we finish. But I think we've got to try and finish fairly much on half the hour. There's a question for you, Logan, about how you close the gap between revenue authorities and policymakers, and who are making these decisions on our behalf. I mean, I think that kind of comes back to a point that we had as a discussion point when we met yesterday, which is we've got these kind of we've got this proposal now, but who's going to make the decisions about when and how and what it looks like, and in terms of implementation, possibly the G20 of countries. Anyway, Logan, I'll let you try and answer that question.
Thank you. At a very basic level, the policy and administrative issues are global issues. Policymakers, normally in the Treasury, in the Ministry of Finance, generally regarded as the high-level thinkers who design things with statistics, analysis, and the admin people must go and knock on your door with a black book and collect, like they used to do it, I believe, in some religious books, to collect. And that still traditionally is how things are viewed, except that the tax part is the social contract, and that influences compliance. It influences other parts of compliance, whether you stop at traffic light, whether you generally civilly obedient, law and order, how you behave towards others. Broader compliance is a social contract issue, and there's a total misunderstanding of the role of the implementers of tax policy and legislation. So we have introduced what we call a nexus, different to the OECD's discussion on nexus, something we call a nexus, where we, with the AU, have developed a platform for the policymakers and the administration to work together. And over the past 4 years, in Africa particularly, have achieved quite a bit of success in narrowing that gap. At the global level, the political decision in this process is certainly the inclusive framework was part of an OECD platform process that feeds into a G20 process. So their ministers and heads of state will eventually make those decisions. Now, why the question also is, so if can heads of state and ministers participate in these discussions if it's then so technical? They don't get to participate in this. It is their representatives. It is just that the developing countries, the African countries, the non-G20 countries did not have a political plug where you have gone to a meeting, you come back, you tell somebody, something happened there, and these are the decisions facing us. We didn't have that. We had nobody to go and tell. We could tell the Commissioner General of our tax authority, but beyond the Commissioner General of the tax authority, there was no further accountability network, not because they didn't want it, it just wasn't there. Until the end, when we managed to get the AU, in Africa's case, to now get us to the Ministers of Finance. And that was 2-3 months running up to the final after 3 years. And so the question is right, we have to narrow the gap, and it's a global issue. Otherwise, in the developed countries, certainly in the G20 and in the G7, the disconnect is not as strong, and therefore the plug-in to where the decisions are made politically, the ministries of finance, the heads of state, is there because it's in every communique, it's in every briefing, it's in every document, but it's not in the rest. Thank you, Logan.
I'm going to ask another question and then come back to you very briefly to give a thought about what we should look out for. Where should our antennae be, and all our alert systems for the next, including the opportunities for the next few months. What should we be looking out for? And because we're talking about the kind of power play that's going on behind as well. So I think that's important. But I just wanted to ask this question of Manuel and Irene from Alex Cobham, who says we definitely agree on the value of greater collaboration, civil society, governments in negotiations, and that there is a serious financial constraint on these governments and on civil society, and the total funding of tax justice civil society globally over the last 20 years is probably less than the OECD's tax unit this year alone. And governments struggle to resource their expertise and expert engagement, and you mentioned that as well, I think, Manuel, to say nothing of the UN Tax Committee and the new bodies. And so how are those gaps filled? That's really the crux of the question. Is there any way to fill these gaps? Manuel, do you want to, could you answer that in a minute?
Well, it will be, not to discourage people, it will be almost impossible to fill the gap. That I was going to say something that I thought was specific to my region, the Asia Pacific region. In November, I had the opportunity to attend the Asia Pacific People's Movement on Debt and Development. So this is sort of like civil society figuring out its money on its own, right? And I found that there was a very interesting 2 cases there that were, I better say very quickly. One case was about coal being exported to Singapore underpriced, right? And then the other case was to coal being exported to India, also underpriced, right? So, and in the case of the second transaction, the higher overpriced, right? Overpriced coal being imported by India. And in the case of the second transaction, the overpriced coal is part of the rate base, right? For the electricity production for consumers, right? So there are actually, just like in the case of climate change, there is actual losses that are actually being undertaken. And when I was at the South Center, we were trying to get developing countries themselves, right? Particularly the leading developing countries, to invest more in these issues. For example, India is a very important player in funding a lot of these technical convenings, right? And Logan has got a very, very big experience with respect to relaxing the resource constraint, right? So the other thing I would say, having worked with the Ford Foundation too for 5 years before, is that we must continue to try to find ways in which some of these private foundations can support a lot of this work. Now, it's very difficult for these foundations to support just campaigning, right? But this is the kind of thing that we are faced with.
Thanks, man. Irene, do you have anything to add, and perhaps you'd also like to kick off if you had any thoughts about, so what should we be alert to in the coming weeks and months?
Right. I think for now, one of the main opportunities with the FACTI recommendations, being within the UN system, is to look at UN processes. The General Assembly coming up in September, but also processes leading to that, the high-level political forum ongoing currently. So to target those and to keep those issues on the table, to keep those recommendations out there, to work with governments, with missions that are looking at the reports, at the recommendations positively, to support them to get those into resolutions. So for example, we did quite a lot of that. We had quite a lot of that even during the FACTI process, connecting through, in my case, through civil society in Africa, and connecting them to the Africa group, to the missions here in New York, to ensure that they had the requisite technical input in terms of language or statements and things like that, analysis, to take positions that were considered positions. So ongoing, that sort of work needs to be done, and that support should be done, across the different regions. For countries which are opposed, to the recommendations, primarily within G7, but not only. I would say civil society in those countries, and also the global tax justice community, needs to target those governments and really call them out on the kind of pressure that they're putting, on the double standards that they exhibit. On the one hand, talking about the need to support COVID response and the need for transparency and good governance, but on the other hand, playing these really kind of dirty tricks. So to call that out, and the role of media in this, I think, is also quite important. We've seen the work done by ICIJ over years, the leaks and so on. So highlighting these processes and what happens in them, and just on that issue about increasing the lack of resources to do this work that Alex raised, I always compare it, and I've worked in 5 years before I came here to New York. I worked in an NGO in Uganda, the Women Lawyers Association. So I know very well, the kind of challenges that NGOs face, in raising funds. But we also connected with organized labor in some of the work that we did around the role of multinational corporations and labor injustice. And one of the things I would say, besides agreeing with Manuel, that we have to push for funding organizations to change their approaches and to change their funding models. I would also say, and the priorities, I'd also say that working more with people's organizations, so organized labor, women's movements, social movements. These are people who are not going to leave that issue, whether there's money or not. And in the work that we did at FIDA, Uganda, with the labor movement in the horticultural sector. That was one of the things said. They were earning less than $30 a month, but they said, we cannot stop working on these issues because this is our livelihood. So that brings sustainability in the processes, but working with them in a way that we bring the technical expertise, but allow them to take the leadership because there's a power that they have that we may not have on issues that impact on them. Indigenous communities impacted directly by land grabs and climate change and issues like that. So we need to change how we operate and how we connect, how we partner. I really hate some language. So partnership is a word that's really been bandied about and changed meaning. But how we work with them in a way that has them front and center and harnesses the strength that they bring alongside the strength that we may have as organized civil society. For me, the analogy is like if you have a tap and it's leaking, are you going to spend more time mopping up the water or closing the leak? So we have to, that's really the question.
Yeah. Thank you, Irene. Logan, I give you a last thought for us about, what should our antennae be aware of in the next, where should we push?
I think it's important that we look at this in two distinct ways. One, that it's a high level political. The technical must still be worked out. So there's two opportunities between now and October, when G20 sits. A lot can happen. There's a lot of unpacking of what is in the deal that needs to happen, and that can happen either within government, who can come out with the reservations they have and come out on what are the things they support that really works for them, and for civil society to unpack this, especially within those G20 countries itself and within the developing countries, to try and crystallize just on the basis of that political agreement. Then I think part of what everybody must prepare for is the period after that, where the devil is going to be in the detail, and one, if it's worth it, protecting the little gains that there are at the technical level, making sure that those are not further eroded, and trying to get more. And for that, you have to put together the kind of technical knowledge and options that transcends who's inside and who's outside the room. And that is going to be critically important for me. And I think that, well, for me, that those are part of the steps. Yeah. That's going to be important. I just want to end with something, and that
very briefly.
Yes, Irene said something about the closing of the policy space. Government must close the policy space. Tax essentially is a sovereign issue. But our experience have been where governments have exercised their sovereignty, it has been violated through the way that treaties have been skewly negotiated, sanctions have been applied, countries blacklisted for giving, for making certain tax arrangements. So it is totally a farce that this sovereignty and closing your tax, especially if you're a developing country, is possible, because the power of developed countries to really just disempower you to do that is real.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Logan. I'd ask everyone to just stay in their seats, as it were. Just first, because I want to thank Irene, Logan, and Butch for their really insightful thoughts and helping us understand this really important, profoundly important issue that's happening around how we who owns our tax rules and the issues of sovereignty that Logan mentions. But I just wanted to now hand over to Alex to in a way just bring the conference to a close and any reflections. Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Liz. And thank you all, Manuel, Irene and Logan. That was just fantastic. And there's so much there that we need to work on. And I want to come back to each of you about different things that you said. And, you know, and that goes for a lot of this conference, actually. There's been so much in this. So, Liz, I want to thank you, having led on, you know, putting together a tax justice and human rights program, as well as bringing out this amazing report. And I want to thank all the people who most of us haven't seen, particularly Helena Rose, who's been working behind the scenes, holding everything together, but also Shauna Jones, Naomi Fowler, Luke Holland, and Zoe Parkin, who've all been doing crucial bits that no one has seen, and it doesn't work without all that stuff. Also, everyone who's appeared in front of the camera, you know, and the different contributions over the 4 days have just been outstanding. There's so much variation and range. I want to talk just for a couple of minutes about a few reflections on this, and kind of perhaps where we are, partly inspired by Derege Alamayehu's annual tax justice lecture yesterday. This idea of that we're divided into experts and activists. I want to reject that entirely. You know, I think experts can be active and activists can be expert, and it's a spectrum if it's anything. But the question that's been raised repeatedly in this session is key. How do we work together where we have both expertise and activism, whether that's in the same organization or completely different ones? How do we bring that to the most powerful outcome, especially when there are moments like now of these negotiations or opportunities of the sort, you know, the potential to begin moving on a UN tax convention? If I kind of look back over the 20 years or so of the tax justice movement that I've had some sense of, we've done a lot to move on the issue of normalization. The ABC of tax transparency has gone from, you know, wild-eyed utopia to basically the global policy agenda. So too has a lot of what we've said on corporate tax, both the idea that we'd be discussing at the OECD how much profit to apportion by formula is pretty revolutionary, as is the introduction of a global minimum tax, even though what's on the table at the minute is both historic but also historically unfair if it goes through as it is. And in terms of the architecture, you know, we now have at least 2 different UN processes, including the FACTI panel, that have recommended a UN tax convention and the discussion of an intergovernmental body within the last year alone. These ideas that used to be completely unthinkable are now there on the table. But somehow we haven't yet hit the stage of realization. Each of these things, to the extent they've been delivered, the ABC of transparency, for example, has largely excluded lower income countries. It's possible that these great steps forward have even exacerbated the global inequalities in taxing rights rather than ameliorating them. And so we're in this position. On the international side, we need to move from normalization to realization. On the domestic side, a similar dynamic. You know, we have much greater acceptance of the need to invest in tax authorities, more and better tax collectors, better resourced tax collectors. We need to deal with tax incentives. We need scrutiny and transparency and a challenge to the level of them. And we need progressive taxes to deliver the 4 Rs and on human rights. There's very little challenge at some level to any of those ideas, and yet we don't see them being realized in any sweeping way. And that's partly the international obstacles that make progressive taxation so hard, but it's also a failure to convert at the domestic level from acceptance and activism into policy change and then to sustain that over time. That feels like the challenge for us all. If we're bringing expertise and activism together, it's around those issues. It's the realization of the norms that we have begun to get embedded. Looking forward, even just the next few months and certainly the next year to you know, next year's conference, it feels like this could be a year of realization. The opportunity, at least, is there to make some really critical steps forward, including at the UN, but even within what remains of this OECD process, to take out the most glaring inequalities in the minimum tax, for example, to limit the extent to which countries' hands are tied in exchange for possibly no revenue at all, and make sure that the door's kept open to the kind of bigger global architectural changes that we need. But look, I should finish because everyone wants to go home. It's been a great 4 days. Thank you for this session again, and thank you everyone who's participated over these 4 days, including all the questions that have come forward. What a great set of thinking they've stimulated and reflected.